broadcasting to you from our studio in Mason City, Iowa, on KNSM, NPR. It's Radio Free Sturgevoy. Radio Free Sturgevoy is paid for by a combination of public funds and donations from viewers like you. Okay, that's Iowa. What are our thoughts on what happened in Iowa? And I want to start off by talking about electoralism and the role of communism in electoralism, and then maybe going on to like what actually happened and how we can read it. Oh, I should begin. I'm joined here by
here, like Buck.
Yes,
Buck.
I'm here. It's me, Bang Bang Duck, as usual, and I'm with MDL or Dicophrenic, and the guy who posts theory from Burger King.
That's a good way to introduce that.
Yeah.
Notorious McDonald's theory post.
Crane, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Kevin.
No. Yeah, no.
Making Kant his bitch in Burger King right now. Joining Radio Free Sturgevoy is Buck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, we have an American election, and you can't. I mean, obviously, if you haven't been living under a rock, we have an American election. Although I would say a surprising number of Americans do not just don't know that there's an election going on.
Oh yeah, I mean it's caucus and primaries, and I mean it's the presidential election stuff too, where it's like this is the whole process that is not really looked at, doesn't get a lot of participation, rightfully so. Like the schedule creeps up on people, they're inconvenient, all that.
I mean, I think the average person is not very politically minded, does not pay a lot of attention. The average person is already a Chad anti-electoralist, really, when you think about it.
I mean, yeah, problem is that's a bit of a too abstract diagnosis. In general, you could say that about many nations, but I think there's particularities to the American electorate.
Yeah. Well, I would say, I think probably half of Americans, I would say, probably the average American does not know or care that the Soviet Union has fallen, right?
Half?
Yeah, totally.
Maybe. Yeah.
Half. What do you mean? Okay, define not caring. Define not caring.
They haven't thought about the Soviet Union in either 30 years or ever, and
okay, all right.
They would say about them from Rocky.
Okay. By the way, for the people hearing, I will be extrapolating my experiences from a colony of the U.S., not a state of the U.S., because I am from Puerto Rico. Y'all gringos are strangleholding my country. I mean, your government is strangleholding my country. But we've definitely been marked a lot by Americanism, and there are definitely some tidbits of stuff that are common. I would say that based on my experiences where I've been in the U.S. and based on my experiences of what I see from the U.S. all the time, and my experiences in Puerto Rico where I live, it's you could say that half of the electorate doesn't have any set in stone or maybe not half. Let's be careful about the numbers, but there's definitely a sizable portion.
Well, no, I actually did a poll.
You did a poll? Okay, interesting.
No, I didn't.
Okay, a sizable portion of the population, I would say, does not have let's say, passionate or set in stone political positions on specific topics. Let's say the Soviet Union. There's probably 30 or 25% of the population that if we sit them down and try to talk to them about Marxism or communism in a very friendly manner, they'll probably think it makes sense, or at least they'll be convinced within the conversation. That's a thing that happens a lot, really. In my experience, it's happened.
I mean, I don't know. I don't usually go around trying to convince people to be Marxists.
I mean, it's context dependent. It's context. It's not that you're talking to any stranger. There's some people don't really think about politics that much, and if you present some ideas in sort of common sense or just basic down to the grain, it's kind of dumb that corporations can use all these loopholes to do this and that, and they can gain so much power or leverage over a population with less resources. You can if you put things in in a good tone with the right terminology, you can convince people to be more left than you think. I
don't know. My experience. Well, one thing that I think is actually really interesting about that is that the libertarian movement in America, there's a lot of like the idea of it is very ideological. The idea of where we like capitalism and we also like individual freedom or whatever. Obviously, completely incompatible, whatever. But one thing I think is very interesting is that once you get onto like the fringe of that movement, there's a lot of interesting ideas going around. I think about the sovereign citizen movement, and they have this obsession with the two sides to human existence, like the legal me and the real me and the all cap stuff and the lack of land claims and all this stuff. And I just think it's really interesting. I think if you translate it into French, it would be completely indistinguishable from modern philosophy.
Wait. Can you repeat that again?
Like sovereign citizen nonsense about naval flags and having they have this idea that like if they use their name that's in all caps, they belong to a different legal code or something.
Oh, okay.
The U.S. is a corporation.
Yeah, I highly recommend if you haven't done it to go YouTube video. Go to YouTube and check out some videos of these people showing up to court. It's wild because they will.
But I think there's something about that, like that two-sidedness, that conflict between the real and the corporate, that is so that there's something. I feel like that's an expression. And
the real? Did you say the real? No, I was more thinking this sort of like, I was thinking more of this like traditional Hegelian distinction between like the civil society and the political sphere, like the political and the civil sphere. Like really, you could see that as like the sphere of capitalist modernity.
Well, I don't know. I'm just talking about sovereign citizens, and they're like the idea that they belong to a secret country that respects their rights.
Oh, okay. Now I'm understanding more. It's like sort of like imagined community sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've met some of those people, and they have given me like a lot of tips. Like they have papers at the ready to hand you about like things you can do to get out of a traffic ticket that they think totally works. It's really fascinating.
Mm-hmm. It's like people have like created like a sort of mysticism, or like they've created like a sort of know-how of the legal legal games. The sort of like local particular legal games of stuff that isn't like even like that grand scale, like traffic lights, like you mentioned. It's like these sort of like really particular local, like non-grand scale, micro scale, legal procedures.
Well, legalistic militia cults sounds extremely China punk, I've got to say.
Yeah.
That sounds very Chinese.
Yes.
I must clarify that none of the legal advice any of these people would ever give me actually made sense or would appear to get me out of a traffic ticket. It seems mostly to work if you can show up in court and harass the proceedings enough and just get someone to want you to leave them the fuck alone, then you are successful. Other than that, I have not. I don't think it works.
Yeah,
I don't
it's
think
like it doesn't work for like people.
Oh, sorry.
So, let's talk about Iowa.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it?
What's up with that?
So we, for anyone who's listening to this in the next news cycle, Bernie Sanders ran in Iowa. Well, today we don't know. We don't have all the results from Iowa. We don't really know what's going on yet. Today is February 7th, 2020, that we're recording this. And right now it seems like Bernie Sanders won the election in Iowa, but it was rigged against him,
Yeah.
I mean,
due to the incredible difficulty of rigging a caucus vote that works like this, and because it's recorded at multiple levels, and due to the incompetence of the Democratic Party, it's become a week-long clusterfuck. But
here's the thing. Yeah.
It looks like Bernie Sanders won, but Pete Buttigieg got to be but the media and the Democrats are living in a weird alternate reality where Pete Buttigieg won. So
here's the thing. But I'm preoccupied about all this, like, obviously it's understandable, all the backlash, all the outrage over, like, how fucking terrible this process has been. Like, I think a good tweet summed it up. There was, like, this sort of, like, clusterfuck of the Iowa election, how they counted, how they, like, did all the approximations, all that bullshit, and how it all failed. It just goes to show you, like, the failure of technological means of mediating collective sort of like decision making. Because when you have these sort of technological fuck ups, there's really no one specific to blame when this kind of stuff happens. It's like the app when they use that app and like it fucked up, like and people were like counting wrong and everything was going to shit. People were like, well, who we are to blame? And that's sort of like the problem of technological, like sort of like very bureaucratic technological decision making. Kind of
well,
like
at the same time, there is a group of people who you can blame, which is you can blame the Democrats for deciding to use an app. A fucking app.
That was not tested at all.
I agree with that. But like, I'm sort of like speaking of like the experience of being on site, seeing all that fuck up happening live. It's like you don't see an immediate face and like and like all that fuck up going on live in the caucuses if you're like in the presence, counting or like defending your votes. That's kind of like, that's kind of what I'm speaking more. I'm speaking more about that experience rather than, obviously there is always someone making a decision. Like technologies don't have this mystical power over us, but we let them, when it's convenient, when it's ideologically convenient for us to like not have a scapegoat. And there is obviously always someone to blame.
Yeah.
One of the interesting parts also, sorry.
I was saying like you had to walk back the Heideggerian claim for a second.
No, it's like I was more talking about the Kafkian sort of like the Kafkian sort of like judgment on bureaucratic procedures. But I think something that preoccupies me is that like with all this outrage, this sort of rightful outrage, people like are getting so legalistic about this that they forget that the DNC is not a public entity, technically speaking. If it wanted to,
the DNC is under no obligation to actually have elections.
Yeah, literally. They could just choose Pete Buttigieg for no reason at all if they wanted to. But obviously, there's complicated dynamics there, but
it would cause a clusterfuck. But the DNC, I guess the DNC, the chairperson, secretary, whatever, could just say, well, we're not doing caucuses we're not doing any more.
Yeah.
I mean, the Republicans pretty much don't, right?
The Democrats.
Oh, that's the Tories.
They do it. Yeah. The Republicans do this.
No, the Republicans do this. Sorry, I was mixed up. The Tories don't do any elections. The Labor does, but that's a completely different and much worse country.
Yeah.
So Iowa is like a symbol too. It's like a symbol of what American democracy is today.
Yep.
Ever since, every 4 years, people vote in November, but they also vote in February in Iowa, and the whole world gets to see pictures of otherwise serious people eating weird, disgusting fried food at the Iowa State Fair, sitting in the same home family Potemkin diners in Iowa and Cedar City and Utah. Who cares? Cedar Rapids.
It's all the same.
It's all the same.
They're if you want to become the most powerful person in the world, this is the first place you start. An obscure Byzantine caucus system in the middle, in a state shaped like a broken Lego block that with a population of approximately 4 people and 200 billion rows of corn.
Yeah.
And
getting a lot of corn subsidies.
Yes.
It's a microcosm of America, really.
And it's the absurdity of it all. And now it's a phony rigged election. Like it's the absurdity of it's American democracy in a nutshell. And I think there's something when you see like people who are on the left and are otherwise, decently well respected, even if they are a bit centrist, going hog wild for Bernie Sanders, get out the vote. It's, pay attention to Iowa, save Iowa, whatever. Let's get this momentum. Let's get it's humiliating. Like, I don't know. Maybe I don't know if I feel this too strongly, but it is a little bit like you're playing their game. You don't even realize it. And your whole, you talk up all this revolutionary, whatever. You talk about being different. You talk about how you want a different kind of thing, and then here you are in Iowa every 4 years, cheering for the, hoping against hope that the Iowa caucus results come out your way.
It's all a bit superstitious, really. I mean, because
it is.
it really boils down to, like, you can hear this in media coverage about it. It's always about this, like, correlation of who, like, typically those who do well in the first two caucus, Iowa and New Hampshire, tend to be the nominee. And it's it's like the whole, just like, it's very ritualistic. And I think further, there's a really interesting thing too. You're pointing out sort of like the state of Iowa as it stands in America today. Like, I think I don't know my history too well on this, honestly, but it would seem that perhaps the importance of, like, Iowa probably originated from, like, the old ways in which, like, agricultural production within the U.S. used to be a bit more of, like, a courted sort of, like, electorate of labor, and possibly also from the older industries within that region. Like, these were bases that politicians, like, used to have to actually, like, curry favor amongst for support. And now it's different in that, like, now it's, like, very much like you're saying, like, it's a symbol. It's not of the same, where, like, economic prominence. It's now just serving as this sort of, like, vaguely hinted at, like, symbol of, like, this is sort of the imagined heartland of America that we've constructed for ourselves. And yet it's not. It's like, we talk about deindustrialization, like the corn production there being propped up more by, like, federal subsidies. There's a sort of, like,
You're coming through a little choppy.
Sorry about that. You're good. It's just like there's that changing relationship of, like, who is reliant upon whom at that point.
Yeah.
And it's like,
go ahead.
Oh, sorry, yeah. And it's, like, largely less consequential. But even despite all of that, the fascinating part is to have seen all of these various ways where it became, like, such a hotly contested scene for this election to really suppress, like, what kind of, like, support Bernie Sanders might have demonstrably had, to the point where you had it turn into just, like, this massive clusterfuck where there was just almost, like, no accountability or organization, and like, differing counts and results between, like, each precinct and what the Iowa DNC was reporting. All of this just total massive, just, like, shooting yourself in the foot for your own legitimacy.
Yeah. And one thing that's worth pointing out here is that this is kind of an undersung part of America, and it's that there are, eking out in the shadows of whatever is in charge of America today, eking out an existence in the shadows of capitalism, there are communities. There are people who really believe in something, and many of those people are deeply involved in local politics. And so this is what we saw in Iowa, was that local precinct chiefs, people running precincts of less than 1,000 people, were the ones who were coming through consistently, reporting their results carrying out, doing the count. I mean, it's not like rocket science, right? But they're doing it professionally, and they're doing it accurately, and they're doing it.
I think that's an interesting. I think that's an interesting phenomenon. Like, that can be, like, sort of, like, brought up as a discussion on a wider scale than just the caucuses. Like, sort of like to what extent is localism more effective than, like, grand scale macro politics? Obviously, as Marxists, we do want to give more importance to the macro political. But, like, what is, it kind of gives us time in some situations to reflect on the relation between the micro and the macro political. Like, how do they bridge? How do we bridge those sort of, like, long-running ties at the local level between people who are actually doing really great communal work, like Millions of Dead Landlords? You do some stuff on your own. I remember you do some work on some housing stuff, right?
Well, let's keep everything classified.
All right.
Yes, classified.
Yeah, we're not saying any names here. We're not saying any names here. But people,
I've been involved in some, like, housing and tenant organizing and anti-gentrification struggles locally.
Yeah. So,
and there is a strong localism to all of that as well.
Yeah, which is valuable on its own. Like, the question is, how do we go beyond that? Like, Like, I think that's an interesting.
Exactly.
Like here in Puerto Rico, for example, never been formed a part of it, but I have heard from some people that are more one of the few radical peoples I have around. There are communes. They're like little communes in Puerto Rico, like anarchist communes, like people that try to do stuff at the local level. And specifically in Maria, actually, well, wow, amazed that I forget. Like, Puerto Rico passed through one of the biggest natural disasters 2 years ago, and we literally were excommunicated from the world for a good month. No, for a good 2 or 3 months. The whole island did not have access to communicating because we literally lost all our power. And like when that happened, you saw rise up all these like local movements. Like literally, there was like stories coming up like later on about how anarchists and like local movements like set up to give power to people on their own and bring up their own generators and like that's some wild stuff, and that's great. But the question is, why does it have to happen when there's a disaster? Why does it have to happen when there's like a big political event? Why can't it be something that's constructed always? Like, I think that's a really big question. I think that's basically one of the main things we think about when we think about the problem of organization. Really, how do we make it long term? I don't know.
Agreed.
Mm-hmm. With regards to Puerto Rico, there's a lot to talk about Puerto Rico in terms of how we go from local to national to international, because Puerto Rico as essentially a colony of the United States is they're like California, and then they don't get to vote for president, and
we can vote in primaries though, which is fucking insane.
Well, that's because primaries aren't run by the United States government.
Yeah, but it's just weird.
This was taught to me in high school as a principle called layer cake federalism. The idea is that no one knows what any group is doing or why ever at all.
Yeah, it's also interesting, like looking up organizations, and like when there's like mass organization, it always happens because of contingent events. For example, I'll give you an example. Y'all were like privy. Y'all were like looking at the news last summer, right? And when Puerto Rico was staging mass protests that lasted for weeks to like oust their governor from its position because of some leaked chat logs where literally the entire elites and cabinets that were formed around their governor were literally spitting on the graves of like all the people that died in Maria. They were like, there was a lot of stuff about corruption that got out there. Like, we saw the faces of how our government fucked us over. And that created a lot of ire that I haven't seen in Puerto Rico since the big, massive protest to get the Marines out of Vieques, which was like around the early 2000s. And it was bigger than that. And I was really impressed. I formed part of a protest, I had to like help. But here's the thing. Once the governor got taken out, everything fizzled out. Even though the person that came to power was literally a cabinet member. Because when the governor gets out, the rules is that the Secretary of State comes in, but the Secretary of State is not qualified. It has to be like the Secretary of Justice. And like, these are all people that the governor chose. So at the end of the day, we just put another one of those motherfuckers in. And even though there were people that were mad at everything, the protests started fizzling out.
Yeah.
And right now, there's a lot of ire now, again, because recently the news came out that a lot of Puerto Ricans literally stormed a storage unit in Ponce recently, where a lot of resources and like aid were found that were literally from the time of Maria. And they were literally just standing there not being given out to people who need them, specifically in the time of the earthquakes. And people got pissed. But I did not see the massive protests I saw last time. There were protests in San Juan, but it was not as big as last time, Yeah. Even though, for my opinion, it should be as big, because that's as big of an insult. The fact that they kept resources and aid covered from people just because they wanted to have them there so that politicians could like look pretty by giving the aid to people in front of the cameras. That's really one of the main reasons why they keep that stuff hidden, because they want to use it for PR, which is fucking disgusting. But yeah, it's kind of like blows my mind. Like, why does a country like Puerto Rico, that's passed to one of like the biggest, most repressive sorts of colonialisms that still go on through today, why is there no massive revolutionary class consciousness? Like that for me, that's always been like an issue that I've always wanted to grapple with, and I'm not gonna assume that I can give a definite answer to, but it's just what gives me a lot to think, and if it gives me a lot to think here, I imagine what you guys have to think over there. When you people are not colonized, you people are living in the first world. I'm not to go all third world this, but you are the biggest. You are forming part of one of the biggest empire in the world right now, the biggest hegemony in the world right now. So it's like, how do we think this?
I think.
Yeah.
I think. I mean, I don't really know, but I think like part of it has to do with. I don't know. I feel like the thing about Puerto Rico is that I feel like it's one of those. And don't take this the wrong way, but I feel like it's one of those places that is sort of slipped through the cracks. It's a weird situation. It's a colonial situation that mostly died out in the '60s. It's got a very strong colonial relationship with the United States, but because Puerto Rico is relative to the United States very small and very isolated, there's a lot of there isn't a lot of there's the question of where does Puerto Rico go? What would become of people? Having an American are Puerto Ricans American citizens? They are, right?
Yeah, that's a funny thing. We do, through the Jones Act, have access to citizenship, but it's only when we go to the U.S. That's why we can't vote for president, because if we were rich citizens in Puerto Rico, we would be able to vote for president.
Oh, okay, that's incredibly fucked up.
No, if you look at the history of all of the laws that were put down in Puerto Rico, the Jones Act is a really curious case legalistically speaking, because it basically defines a sort of it's like when you're in Puerto Rico, you have like a second-rate citizenship. You only get the first-rate citizenship once you go to the U.S. You only get full citizenship if you stay and go to the U.S. That's how it works. The only sort of advantage you get is that you don't need to do visa stuff to go to the U.S. You don't need a passport to go to the U.S. But even then, racism is rampant. There have been a lot of cases of airport staff that don't know that Puerto Ricans are technically allowed to come in without passports because they don't know who we are. That's a thing.
Wow.
I don't know how the education system is going around in some of the states around there, but that stuff still happens. So yeah, technically we are citizens, but it's only once we get there. We get the potential for a citizenship, basically, and that creates that's why there's a bigger diaspora of Puerto Ricans in the U.S. than population over here. We have rampant poverty. We have the biggest poverty rate if we compare ourselves to the States. We're not in a good position, really. And what is more interesting to me is also, I think one of the reasons, this sort of phenomenon happens in Puerto Rico and why in Puerto Rico there's not this big tradition of revolutionary movements. There was only really one big attempt at a revolutionary movement, and it was literally stopped in its tracks because of an undercover agent. This is the famous Grito de Lares, if y'all are interested in looking it up. Obviously, it's good to go back to Fanon. Fanon theorized a lot of this colonial dynamics well. Specifically, this sort of dynamic where the colonized are colonized in a lot of ways by how they view themselves. The fact that colonized try to imitate their colonizers is really one of the main ways that colonialism grapples us. And Americanism in Puerto Rico is very rampant. Maybe not culturally as much as I'd expect, but in terms of how to manage the economy, how to manage our government, Americanism is very, very rampant. And I think that has to do with that sort of colonial dynamic that Fanon describes in Direction of the Earth. So yeah.
So when we talk about, I do want to get back to I do want to center this idea of how these situations transform, and I think. I mean, what the thing about Puerto Rico is that I think it is one of those situations where it's intractable outside of communism. There isn't really a position that can be taken. I think beyond obviously universal de-citizenship in the Socialist World Republic, etc.
No, in the independence, really. Yeah, also, for us, independence, which is
Mhm.
The question is, what does independence mean for Puerto Rico? In terms of sovereignty, because my understanding is that there's no way it would be anything but like a Central Africa thing.
I mean,
Where
independence here is not widely supported, but I don't see how you can have a revolutionary situation of a colony like us without
Well,
cutting up.
how would you have a successful independent? I'm just asking
I
questions.
mean, no,
How would you have a
I mean,
successfully independent move? How would you have a successful independence movement in Puerto Rico? Without the destruction of the United States. At which point, there's no.
I mean, okay, I think we could
You know.
start there. The destruction of the United States.
Yeah, that was actually kind of a
That was like you gave
an
you gave it pretty easy there.
that was actually an avenue I'd been wanting to kind of go down with this inquiry as well, where it's just like when we talk about building that internationalism or bridging those
course.
bridging those foreclosed opportunities for revolutionary movements in like colonized places too. Like a necessary part of that is also like the weakening of empire or like figuring out how to tactically exert pressures on like a capitalist empire that destabilize it significantly. And that's important because it's just like oh, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, I've been thinking about this, and I'm really not certain what you can do. Like these things are really, even this is one of those things, which is that America's most oppressive, whatever imperialist groups are really kind of run out of a shed at this point. Like the U.S. is not exerting. It's very difficult for the U.S. to lose anything in an imperialist struggle because it's the extent to which it engages itself in imperialism. Obviously the U.S. is extremely engaged in imperialism, but it's not. But numerically speaking, in terms of forces, in terms of real forces committed to the field, it's fairly low outside of places like Iraq and Afghanistan, where like for example, the U.S. is doing a lot to like suppress piracy in Somalia. So there's like U.S. destroyers shooting Somalis and stuff. But what are you going to do? Fly to Yemen and buy an anti-ship missile, right?
Yeah, it's like I've been thinking about this a lot lately too, especially I did a lot of thinking about it, especially after the Soleimani assassination, where it's like, I mean, imperialism today, like it's a forever war kind of struggle, which plays on the sort of dynamic you have to adopt in a military struggle with a largely like voluntary army, and it's adapted to this largely with automated like mechanized systems of warfare, drones, like things that can be done at a distance and reducing your sort of like boots on the ground initial costs, and it's largely wrought through like sustained like military like forces in like certain areas that can exert a greater degree of destruction than your opponent with less force of application. And it's all or 1 second real quick, it's also like very quick strikes too that can like massively destabilize but not destroy too much, because a lot of this like modern imperialism relies on like not disturbing these like important like value chains upon which like empires rest atop, because if they were to undergo this like massive like worldwide conflict, that would also entail just like massive destabilizations of the entire like structure of capital at present.
There's no practical way that one thing that I think is there's no practical way for the U.S. to go to war with China, in other words. But one thing that I think is worth pointing out is the role of like comprador regimes, which is that the idea. I think the idea of like an imperialist core versus a non-imperialist fringe. I don't think that definition really works, because when we get to like, for example, places within the imperialist core, within, for example, the United States, there are a lot of places in the United States with extremely dire conditions. Like not to say like, there's this idea of like the labor aristocracy, but you try telling a meat packing worker in South Carolina that they're a labor aristocrat. People are working 16-hour days. They don't have fresh water. They don't have fresh food.
Yeah. It
it's
doesn't
not.
necessarily apply on the same geopolitical
Yeah.
level.
There isn't you could say very much in sort of like the imperialized, in the golden age of empires, you could describe a strong difference between the metropole and the colony. The metropole is wealthier, more stable. People in the metropole tended to be citizens, et cetera, et cetera. But that doesn't really happen anymore. And one thing that's happened since the anti-imperialist movement was destroyed is that the regimes are in the third world are that the governments in the third world closely cooperate with the governments of the first world in order to impose austerity, in order to impose ruinous conditions, in order to impose all the horrors of capitalism and resource extraction. And that's one of the reasons I'm skeptical about, for example, Puerto Rican independence, because the idea of independence is the idea of independence that independence had in like the 1960s, the anti-colonial movement, was tied to ending this division between metropole and colony, and it's no longer tied to that. It's no longer a matter of sovereignty and borders. It's now directly related to.
Oh no, I'm not.
Yeah,
okay, I'm not defending the sort of like, national sort of like we need to like set up our own national borders stuff. Like this is gonna be that has to be internationalist. Maybe I'm a bit of a heretic here. I will warn you if you talk to other Puerto Rican leftists, my point of view may not be common on this. There are probably more people that would go harsh on the fact that independence, it has to occur regardless of internationalist context. I don't think that's practical. However, to go back to some of the other things you people were saying, specifically about like war, I think it's good, and I recommend. I'm going to assume you people. I'm going to recommend this book by Paul Virilio on speed and politics. He talks about this really well because we live basically the age of modern imperialism is like it's like a sort of space where like destruction has become a like object of production itself. Destruction has become a product of, an object of production itself. And when you have the speed, like you said, this sort of like the fact that like big military powers can like strike anywhere in like times that people cannot react. What that creates is a sort of phenomenon where like the spaces of the world like become annihilated, virtually speaking. Because now, and I think we need to reappropriate this phrase. I think it's an inversion from Clausewitz. This idea that politics, at the end of the day, politics in the age of like hyper imperialism or whatever you want to call it, this sort of like globalized dynamic of capitalism. Politics has just become a continuation of war, and war is just a continuation of production. Really, I think that's really
the inversion of Clausewitz, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's an inversion. I don't know if it's the inversion or the affirmation of it. I think it's the inversion, but the inversion was already said by someone else. I am not sure. Please correct me. I think Foucault said this in one of his like 70s College de France lectures.
I know at Good Boy Machine, Gondola on Twitter was talking about this and attributed it to Deleuze and Guattari's treatise on nomadology.
Oh, to Deleuze. Oh, Deleuze is nomadology. Yeah, I think
we're not going to talk at all about electoralism, are we, this evening?
Oh, we'll get
around. We'll get to that. We'll get to it. But we're talking some interesting stuff here. Yeah, it's definitely something
about empire and stuff.
No, it's not like it's not. This isn't really important. It's just
But
you talk about American electoralism without discussing empire is the question.
Yeah, we can't really. It's not. You Americans need to remember there's a world outside, that you people are a part of. Sometimes. Interestingly enough, that's sort of like I think French theory in the 70s can definitely talk to us about these dynamics of like global war. Of course, you need to always tie it down to this sort of like Marxist framework, specifically how it relates to capital flows, to the value chains.
Yeah.
Specifically what you mentioned, this idea that a destruction is produced, but obviously it's never like a complete destruction. There has to be destruction has to be done in a way that can be reconstructed so that, there could be production.
Yes.
For example,
exactly.
If can I recommend a Murder of the Dead, Amadeo Bordiga? That's is an excellent text. It's I was thinking about it all when as you were talking about Maria and the earthquake. Murder of the Dead is exactly about that. It's about the response of capitalist governments to natural disasters.
Yeah, that's probably like that would probably, I haven't read it, but that would probably be a better sort of like resource than having to read. I mean, it's not terrible, but obviously when people talk about capitalism and disaster, they always like reference the liberal journalist. Now what was her name?
Naomi Klein.
Yeah, Naomi Klein, right? Where she did a book on. I think she did a book recently that references Puerto Rico. So like do you have this like analysis of like privatization and austerity, which is always like it's not bad, but it's not doesn't come from an explicitly Marxist framework.
Well, the problem with privatization as such is that like often it gets particularized as like a single like evil external to capital or like a very agent thing, and I think it's much more useful to look at privatization rather as one like a consequence of like the concentration that results from accumulation and like the necessity of these like concentrating capitals to also sort of like centralize control of surplus value getting produced and like through like transnational corporations, and like that centralization like of course like ultimately overtakes the sort of public sphere, and then that's that whole like public private dichotomy.
It gets blurry.
Posed by it gets blurry.
It's blurry, and here's the interesting point. I think this is really interesting. When we talk about privatization as like this specific evil in terms of capital, we also forget the other rich facts, and that's the idea that privatization is not necessarily is sort of like this idea that we have like one firm, sort of like very individualistic notion of privatization. I mean, we shouldn't forget Volume 3 of Capital. Like Marx reaches the conclusion that capital has a tendency to create social. Where like private capital is at the end of the day becomes social capital. Like you can have like a sort of like you can have a sort of bastardized version of cooperation among capitals as like the substitute, as this sort of substitute to like normal modes of private property. This is why we shouldn't think that having things be like collectively owned implies that we have transcended or subverted capital. Not necessarily. And obviously, this also should allow us to critique the sort of like dynamics, for example, where like you have a state economy controlling sectors, and you think, well, this is like better. I mean, maybe it is, but like for how much really? Is it really like changing something? Probably not. I don't know. I'm sorry for being a bit like frenzied. I suck at like explaining myself.
No worries.
No, you're good. Yeah. We can kind of bring it around to Iowa and electoralism right now, I think, in these sort of discussions around like empire and like positions of empire as relates to colonialism and, this dynamic of capitalism where it's like empires now rest on this sort of productive destruction in warfare, as well as like value chains very much as well, and maintaining that position. It's like, I think what was really interesting to me to see this week in the Iowa shit show was like in the first votes thrown in this like Democratic primary, like something like severely apparently very wrong with any attempts to like even control these processes. Like the sphere of like bourgeois politics is kind of like rapidly corroding in a lot of ways, which doesn't mean that it organically self-destructs on its own by any means, but is like very much collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions, if you will. And it's like to the point where it's like we can all look at like a Bernie Sanders campaign and easily be like, well, this is just very mild social democratic reform. But also, there are millions of people like very invested in the potential gains that are being promised by this movement. Like the demands are resonating with people, and it's like very, meat and bread, like quality of life issues. But the reaction from the establishment within that party is such that it really aims to kind of like really destroy itself long run. And it's because of just like the massive like need that US capitalism has right now for these like heavily like insurance related profit industries over these, you know, like these massive amounts of like fictitious profits, which really like rest their claims entirely on like debt peonage, like these like you could say like future claims on like surplus labor out of this.
Yeah, yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
Like
it's
future
just
claim,
about like subjugating.
Yeah.
Yep. I mean, literally, it's like
The interesting thing about this is that the medical debt claim it's a way of double counting, really, because it's a claim on future expenditures, but it's double. You're keeping two books because you claim it once as, you know, for someone, but it's also that money that goes to paying medical debt or paying student debt in, you know, 2035 is money that's not going to buying, you know, the iPhone 25X or the Japanese sex robot or whatever.
Yeah.
2035. You know what I mean?
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting example.
So it's basically a way of transferring consumption from the future to the present.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's interesting because it's just the sort of, it's very fictitious, and it doesn't. I swear, I read some pages. Marxist was talking about this. I think Ad Funkel posted a screenshot of this, of like this sort of like of what I'm talking about here. But like there's this sort of like thing like state economies and like this sort of state intervention that doesn't really care about profitability. Like profitability has become like a sort of second priority to like maintaining the fictitious flow of profits and development of like production, of like consumption. You have to keep the facade of profitability and like investment by giving loans, by giving, you know, all by the management of debt, really.
Well, even then, like I wouldn't even know whether to attribute that level of like conscious action in this process too, because to like apply the, you know, the Marxist critique of fetishism to this as well is like, look at how many economists or people involved in these industries and like, you know, financial capital as a whole, like legitimately just see money capital as like autonomous valorization. And like it results from their like complete division as like a sort of like sphere with its own particular interest within global capital. It's fascinating, you know, it's that sort of just isolation of itself from productive functions. Like profit is a greater number on your balance sheet. It doesn't matter how you get it. They don't have to do that. They don't have to.
It's just money off account. It's just money off account for them.
And I think what's interesting about the Sanders campaign is that it's not a political moment that can disappear very easily, because it's not a political moment that can easily disappear because people need relief from this debt. People need people need medical care. People need infrastructure, and just because, you know, Bernie Sanders is not going to be able to carry out this program, it doesn't mean that the material demand people have, like Bernie Sanders didn't create this material demand.
Exactly.
You know, he was sitting in Bernie Sanders has been sitting in Washington talking for 40 years now, 50 years now.
Yeah.
About socialism or whatever. And he didn't work at it for 80 years. This isn't the culmination of his 40 years of effort. This is because the moment is now. You know, the people need that kind of politician that he is, and people need that kind of program, and so people are you know what I mean? It's not a case of when we talk about like the Bernie Sanders movement, we're talking about a movement that sort of created Bernie Sanders, not a movement of Bernie Sanders or by Bernie Sanders.
Of course, it's not
exactly.
like a great man. We shouldn't great man theory this. Never.
Yeah.
Never great man theory stuff.
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean.
If to make a connection here to what you were saying, Buck, about the sort of like Puerto Rican protests and the sort of like dissolution of that like massive energy there, like to depose your governor, and the sort of like very disillusioning product of that effort, in that, you know, fundamentally the like
all you got rid of was a symbol, not really the problem.
Exactly. And this is like,
and people are demanding something else today. They're demanding a relief from the problem.
Oh yeah, that's a good way of putting it. But it's also like the same, danger that we have to also like figure out how to engage within what is going on within the Sanders campaign and the sort of like what I think is apparent like a legitimate like expression of political will finding political expression within this to also further that as well and also be able to like deepen that critique and connections beyond that campaign to like if he is successful because then you're going to have to figure out how to organize and like make a major break from just like potentially like your politically active base of people that just defend a president.
I'm sorry, you broke up there a little bit.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying, like, it's like, because the other thing, too, is like, what we have to kind of fight here is the sort of like the fetish construct of the political figure in charge. Like, see that that movement that like created the Bernie that we see right now as primary.
It's like, I think it's just interesting because it's like, it's basically the question of how do we think radical organization without, like, let's say, a specific leader representative? How do we get out of this representative logic of, like, political organizing? Is it possible? It's been theorized, like, the people, these Italian Marxists, or like that ended up becoming liberals, have been trying to theorize this sort of like the question of radical democracy, the sort of like democracy that's like about the multitude, about the multiples of people without any sort of like specific or like how I say long-term leaders. Which is something interesting because literally the only case, maybe this is my ignorance showing. If you guys have any other examples, that'd be great. But like the example that comes up to my head right now of a scenario where like a sort of like non-representative sort of like big political organization happened. It happened in Puerto Rico in 2010. Don't know if you people are familiar with the big student strikes in Puerto Rico 2010. It happened weeks after weeks of protests for like not so that students wouldn't get their tuition raised, so that they have to pay more. And basically what happened was that meanwhile the student strikes were happening, there was like a huge radical democratic organization of students that were constantly voting to like organize resources for the people on the strike, or organize resources to get people to government areas and like institutions and try to like fight for the student movement. And this was all done like on a very radically democratic basis. Like every day and every night, you had like a bunch of people always like down and up to like make radically democratic voting processes that were like not like bureaucratic, like what you see in like normal election processes. And this all happened in the student movement, which is what really fascinates me. And this is the only time I've ever seen a snippet of that sort of politics happen. Like, how did we get that to happen outside of that scenario? Outside of like this really local and specific scenario of student movements that, in my case, is what I saw.
So I had some ideas. I think I talked about these in chat yesterday. The thing that I struck on was that the conception of the Communist Party that has dominated since the 20th century has been of a vanguard party. The idea, Lenin conceptualized the Communist Party as an organization that would stand at the forefront of the revolution, of the most politically aware, the most militantly active. I think historians have described them as professional revolutionaries. It was an international group of people from all over Europe. And I think Kautsky described the socialists as like the general. I'm not willing to call anything Kautsky described communism, by the way. Kautsky described socialists as like the general staff, the Generalstaff of the workers' movement. And I think these are sort of aggrandizing positions. I think they're wrong. I think a more proper, and the reason I think they're wrong is because if we look at history, the group that has historically wielded the greatest amount of power in the workers' movement, and the group that has been able to deliver that power in the most politically prescient way, and the group that has been, consistently at the forefront of radical action, has always been the working class itself. It's always been the action of the working class itself that has created sort of revolutionary potential and has pushed revolutions further. And it's always been, this idea, this conflict between the so-called advanced portions of the working class, which compose the Communist Party, and the great mass of the working party, which tends to form a more radical faction. And for example, we can see this in the Cultural Revolution, where you had, the workers' councils were forming Soviets, and they were, trying to communalize production in a whole bunch of different grassroots regions across China, and yet that ultimately failed because of the Communist Party for internal reasons put its finger on the nail against the workers' movement. And so I think that the way out of this is to reconsider the position of the Communist Party as a military, in the military terms. And I think the correct position of the Communist Party should be as a logistics train, as a way, as sort of a commissary, as a way to get people like support.
No, yeah, I agree.
A support network that, for example, that the working class has historically had great difficulty building up on its own. Historically, the problem with strikes has been, to put it in sort of military terms again, has been that its lack of resistance to shock action. So it's been, fragility, economic fragility. It's been lack of ability to, it's been low strike funds. It's been a lack of places to run, resiliency, and it's a lack of supply. And I think that I think that the Communist Party is uniquely poised, should be uniquely positioned to support that. Should be uniquely positioned to serve as that logistics train, as that organizational footprint, even in times that there are no radical action.
Yeah, I would agree with that too, because, the old militarist views, right now, are not applicable, at least, within the U.S., and I also think that there's a significantly, fractured, proletariat, as well as, a very, difficult understanding and classification of class in the U.S. There are, clear proletarians, but then there's, large, surplus population that is, I would say, increasingly absolutizing. There's also just people that are dependent on the wage fund nominally and earn a wage, but that varies very greatly in terms of what access to a mortgage or a home they could have, which transfers a degree of class interest. It's not cleanly cut here, but I would still say that there's a case that the sort of ongoing crises of post 1997 crisis world economies are deepening class divides substantially. I noticed that watching that American Factory movie about the Fuyao glass production plant that moved into I think it was in Michigan or something. I don't recall. Wherever Sherrod Brown is a senator, because he made an appearance in the film. But there's an interesting thing in there where it just, so many of the people there used to work at a GM auto plant before 2008. 2008 happened, lost their jobs. That whole area, people, thousands of people unemployed. Then this glass production plant from China comes in, hiring them, and it's the first sort of steady work a lot of people are able to get back since the recession. And at GM, they were making $29 an hour. Now they're making about $12 an hour. And a lot of people talked about how they had lost their homes in 2008 and now had to live in a friend's basement or, rent a cheap apartment if they could find it. So it's you still see that. We talk about the labor aristocracy dynamic, but that is rapidly diminishing. And what was also noticeable in there as well is conversations even among the Chinese capitalists moving their production over here was how unprofitable American workers were for them. They didn't work enough. There's they had weekends. They only worked 8 hours a day. They had fat fingers. That was the funniest part. They don't move fast enough. All this stuff. It's America as an industrial workforce isn't keeping up with like global capital, and it like kind of takes like a different sort of like creative route to understanding like class composition in organization at this stage.
And I think I mean, I agree with you. I think that there are there just isn't anything. There isn't anywhere for American workers to go, and there isn't anywhere for American poor people to go. There isn't anywhere for people who are struggling in America to go. Just not just politically, but geographically and physically. And I think that it will. I don't know how to do this. I mean, it's a lot easier said than done. But
Totally.
But I think that is when we think about what we want a communist party to do, what we think we want to be, well, if we want to be in a communist movement and we want it to mean something, then it has to begin with making practical changes to the world around us, and building those spaces, building that resiliency, building those organizations. And this is, I mean, to be honest, this is some of the stuff that the state cracks down on the hardest. You can stockpile AR-15s in your yard for 12 years before the ATF come a knocking, but you start handing out lunches to kids, you start organizing flu vaccines, you start, you know what I mean?
No, yeah. I mean, I think when I found like some organized experiences, like it's really best to just like, I mean, aim at like very immediate struggles that you notice from like people that you like meet or know or work or live around with. And a lot of it can just be like very simple, like, oh, this is a problem. How do we solve this? Certain efforts can like become more intentionally organizations if like they demand of it. And some people like work to set out to intentionally create this from the start too. But I think it like works best with like attacking these very immediate things too, where it's like, we talk about like building a revolutionary consciousness. Well, it's like the key part of doing that too is to also like, I mean, be able to produce an experience by which that consciousness can be gained in like an antagonistic situation that they like people have to undergo.
Yeah.
Like, and it's like we have to figure out how to push those, and like these can be like campaigns that even small organizations can undertake to achieve a certain end, while in the same process, like you were saying, like figuring out how to meet those mutual needs, because organizations like shouldn't exist to like solely fulfill themselves. Like they should work to become like entities in which the participants are also like learning how to mutually support each other within that. So it's like this kind of like tightrope of like finding a carrot at the stick about like the objective to reach, and then the ultimate sort of like solidifying of ties within, even if that objective should not be reached immediately. It seems to be like that kind of seems to be like the two things most important to focus on in these.
Yeah. And just before we finish out, because we've gone about an hour and 10 minutes, when we talked about, what should people do instead of electoralism, I think it's important to look at running in elections and being part of an electoral movement as a way to accomplish ends, and there are a lot of ways to accomplish, ends. And when you line up like running in bourgeois elections, when you line up the effectiveness of that, compared to the resources invested, it's not always that high. Anti-electoralism isn't a position based on like ideology. It's not based on like we don't want to reinforce the legitimacy of the bourgeois state. It's a pragmatic position based on the fact that it's kind of a waste of time for a lot of people. And sometimes something happens. It's like Bernie Sanders' election. Sometimes there are things that it's hard not to be interested in, but it's also we have to be realistic about if we want to really achieve our goals, we have to be realistic about how we can achieve those. Yeah. And there are ways to, I don't know any way to get people healthcare that doesn't involve making it a national issue.
No, yeah. And I mean, at the same time, that's kind of like one of those sort of like escalating demands beyond the limits of what like capital as it's currently composed can really accommodate that, pushing a sort of like large, like national scale issue of people like sort of like shaping this as like a demand for their own lives can kind of like become a social struggle much beyond what we hope like a politician to achieve it, you know? Like
Yeah,
I think no, sorry.
go ahead.
I was just saying, like, I think that's also like sort of the implicit threat that perhaps like some of the ruling class, like some of the more like astute ones may fear, but like in some people like involved in these politics, like more heavily involved in this campaign of politics, probably has in their back of the mind is that like to enforce that is to also like actually push some sort of like larger scale antagonisms well outside of a traditional legislative battle, you know?
Yeah, and to make that this is something we've been talking about a lot. It's just the fact that it's important to remember that it is not 1945 in England. You know, the medical industry is an extremely profitable, extremely large part of the American economy. The American economy is an economy that does not have very many extremely large, extremely profitable sectors, and it almost certainly serves as a shadow bank as well. So when Bernie Sanders says Medicare for all, and I don't know if he realizes this, but when Bernie Sanders says Medicare for all, the actual implications of that policy go a lot further than just healthcare. They really cut at the heart of large swaths of the economy. And I think this is my worry with Sanders and with the Sanders campaign is that when they realize that, they'll be forced to back down instead of, damn the torpedoes, go straight ahead. Do you think they'll? I guess that's where we can end it with. Do you think they'll back down? Do you think they'll blink if it comes to it? Do you think they'll blink?
That's a hard question because it's like, I think some people will blink and some people won't, and I think that's going to produce like its own fracture in how these sort of like struggles translate, later on, especially if successful, like especially if he becomes president. I think you will see like and they experience the inevitable disappointments of like Congress like shooting that shit down and like industries clamping down on this stuff. Like I think you're going to see like fractures form that differ on how to handle the situation, which to an extent I actually see that as a positive outcome as well too, potentially spurring other forms of organization. And if we constantly have these sort of like
Sorry, you cut out.
And we have these like fractures in political constituencies that can become themselves sort of like bases of social composition along lines of class, then you could really see like a destabilization of American empire as well too. I don't know. It's like I would say I think some people are going to blink and become like defenders of the national interests, and I think others are probably not going to back down.
So just to finish up, where do you think Bernie Sanders will blink? Personally,
ooh,
because I honestly think
most
that
likely.
Yeah, I honestly think that I think that he'll keep to it right up until the Congressional Budget Office or whoever talks about these kinds of things says, look, we're gonna go, the economy is going to crash. So many people are going to die. So many people are going to lose their jobs. So many people, et cetera, et cetera. We have to pick a different option.
Yeah. You think they're going to have like the sort of like, who was it? Like the ECB or the IMF having the come to Jesus moment with like Syriza or Varoufakis or somebody?
Yeah. When they see that they ran on and won as, damn the torpedoes, damn the IMF, damn whatever they say. We're going to do it. We're going to come hell or high water. We're going to do it. But when it actually came down to it, they couldn't do it.
Yeah. I think that's going to be what we have to balance here too, is just like somehow opportunistically like leveraging that momentum to be able to have it not entirely rest on whether or not Sanders blinks. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think people are invested enough in Medicare for all that, I suppose I should say decommodifying medicine, decommodifying medical care, that I think it will survive Sanders.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, the insurance industries themselves are just like, so insanely profitable and
Hmm.
have like such a degree of like political influence that they're not going to back down on clamping this down either.
Oh
So
yeah, no.
you have like a very long-term antagonism right here
Hmm.
ready.
Again, yeah. I mean, there's no way that people don't. People are really angry about this, and I think they're just gonna get more angry. Uh, it's not like Greece, where like the Greek economy has slowly started to recover, and that's my understanding at least, is that post Syriza, uh, the IMF and the ECB went a little more lenient on them. There was some like plan, not like lenient, but there were restructurings of debt. There were changes in the situation that meant that the damn the torpedoes position of Syriza was no longer, considered an existential necessity by the Greek people. Whereas I think that a victory on medical care for the insurance companies, they're going to jack up prices. They're going to increase.
Oh yeah, I mean
costs. Yeah.
They don't have any other way of doing business.
Mm-hmm.
It's just renting your life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rant.
All right. Well, that's our episode.
Yep. Hope you all have fun.
That's our episode.
I'll try to do better next time.
No worries.
Yeah. I had a good time with everybody.
Yeah, it's good having you on the show every so often. Yeah.
I want to be on more.
Mm-hmm.
We'll try.
So yeah, we've got some plans for what we want to cover.
Yep.
We want to start covering. Let me see what was said. We want to start covering like the Soviet Union and we've mentioned the Second World War a lot. We're still trying to figure out what the best way to talk about that is.
That would be interesting.
So
yeah, I think we're done here. I mean,
I think we should probably also do some more media reviews, like talking about like we did the Joker episode, and I don't know, Parasite maybe. I want to talk about Wolf Warrior.
All right.
And where there's also some
I
talk.
haven't seen
Wolf
any
Warrior
of that.
is a Chinese action movie from like 2010 or something.
I got to see that.
So I'm thinking talking about Wolf Warrior is really interesting, and also talking about and there's also been some talk about doing like a Star Wars Saga edition role playing game thing, and I don't know if there's any interest in anyone listening to that or like recording any kinds of episodes of that.
Where there's a will, there's a way.
It's a little out of the wheelhouse of this program so far, but
Yep.
All right. Good night.
Hey. Yep. Okay,
Good night.
don't we have to like turn off Bear? See how?
Yeah.